Welcome to This Explainer. I am absolutely thrilled you're joining us because today we're doing something really cool. We are going to trace this fascinating domino effect that's embedded right into the core of our topic. We're looking at a massive theological arc. Okay, so let's just dive right into this. We're going to see how a single, and honestly kind of academic-sounding legal premise, actually triggers this entirely comprehensive, life-altering worldview. We are talking about a journey that moves from the way a person is judged, all the way down to how they face their absolute deepest suffering, and ultimately how they view eternity.
Here is our roadmap for the arc. We're going to hit 5 key stages: the divine exchange, the believer's paradox, the call to worship, finding comfort in the fire, and we'll wrap it all up with the eternal perspective.
Starting off with our very first domino in part 1, the divine exchange and the mechanism of justification.
All right, to understand the rest of this arc, we really have to grasp this initial step, and the sources frame it strictly as a legal and spiritual transaction. We've got to grapple with this heavy concept called imputation. So the imputation of righteousness is this legal and spiritual act where God credits or reckons the perfect righteousness of Jesus Christ directly to a believer. Think of it in, say, everyday financial or accounting terms. If your bank account is just deeply, hopelessly overdrawn, imputation isn't just the bank wiping the debt clean. No, it's like a billionaire transferring their infinite wealth directly into your zeroed-out account. A believer is legally declared just because they are effectively clothed in the perfect obedience of Christ.
100%. That's a big number, right? But the sources emphasize this over and over. That is exactly how much of this legal declaration of justification is God's work. 100%. A person is declared just without literally any of their own moral merit. It's not earned. Because, the logic goes, if righteousness could somehow come through human effort or, keeping the law perfectly yourself, then Christ's work would have been completely in vain.
So how does this actually work? It happens through a mechanism called double imputation, which is basically a massive two-way transaction right at the cross. On one side of the ledger, all of a believer's sins, and that means past, present, and future, are imputed or applied to Christ. He pays the ultimate penalty. Then on the flip side, Christ's absolute perfect righteousness is imputed back to the believer. So they're treated by God as if they had never sinned at all and as if they had been as perfectly obedient as Jesus himself. It is a total, incredible swap of ledgers.
Now, you might be wondering, is this some new theological invention? Well, to prove this isn't a new concept at all, the Apostle Paul points way back to an ancient scriptural precedent in Genesis 15:6. It says, "Abraham believed God, and it was counted unto him for righteousness." Paul notes something absolutely crucial here. This happened long before the religious law was even given to Moses, and even before Abraham was circumcised. It's presented as the ultimate proof that this imputation, this crediting of righteousness, happens through faith alone, entirely apart from any human works.
But, okay, we have to acknowledge that brings up a really famous theological tension, doesn't it? On one hand, you have Paul teaching justification completely apart from works. But then you have the book of James arguing fiercely that faith without works is dead. So how exactly do the sources reconcile this? Well, they do it by framing the timeline differently. True justification by faith, they argue, inevitably leads to a changed life. So those good works that James is demanding, they aren't the cause of the justification. Not at all. They are the inevitable evidence of a living, breathing faith. If the root is faith, well, the fruit is works.
And that brings us nicely to part 2, the believer's paradox, or Simul, Iustus et Peccator. Now that the legal transaction we just talked about is totally settled, it actually creates this intense, ongoing psychological tension for the believer. It's summed up in this classic Latin phrase, Simul, Iustus et Peccator. Translated, that means being simultaneously righteous and a sinner. Essentially, the believer is existing in two completely different realities at the exact same time. On the one hand, they are peccator, a sinner in their actual, ongoing, messy human nature with a conscience that absolutely still recognizes their daily flaws. But simultaneously, they are Iustus. They are legally righteous, completely clean, and perfectly accepted in God's sight simply because they're leaning on Christ's obedience. I mean, talk about a paradox, right?
Let's move on to part 3, the call to worship and the response of the heart. So, how does a person naturally react when they fully internalize this totally unearned, legally justified status? It sets off a very specific causal chain. The realization of justification by faith immediately creates honest humility. You finally recognize yourself exactly as you are, an unworthy sinner who has been handed absolute grace. And that humility completely wipes out any grounds for human boasting. which then naturally gives way to pure adoration for the one who actually gave you the gift. Together, this humility and adoration build an unshakable foundation for true worship. And in the sources, worship is framed as literally the central purpose for which humanity was created.
In practical terms, this worship takes on several different forms. Yes, absolutely, it involves music, making a joyful noise, and continuing in prayer. But the sources are clear. God vastly prefers a humble heart over empty, lip service rituals. True worship actually means presenting your own body as a living sacrifice. Fundamentally, it's about obedience and practical mercy out in the real world. To obey is better than sacrifice, and true religion means actively caring for the vulnerable, like widows and orphans.
Which brings us to part 4, comfort in the fire. This is all about suffering and assurance.
Okay, so how does this theological foundation act as an anchor when real life hits? During times of global crisis or just really deep personal suffering. Well, because of justification, the believer's conscience is completely free from the absolute terror of God's judgment. You have total peace with God. And when a person knows their eternal standing is secure, it completely flips the lens through which they view temporary pain. Suffering is no longer seen as some sort of divine punishment or condemnation. Instead, it gets framed as a refiner's fire. It's a tool for divine discipline and refinement, designed specifically to strengthen a faith that the sources say is far more precious than gold.
Looking at the historical accounts, we see individuals practically applying this comfort in some truly extreme hardship. Take Job. He literally lost his wealth, his health, his children, yet he somehow maintained this patient trust in God's tender mercy. Or David, who faced frequent, life-threatening distress and anguish, but constantly found comfort by viewing God as his high tower and his shield. And then there's the Apostle Paul. He endured imprisonments, shipwrecks, and what he called a physical thorn in the flesh, yet he discovered that God's grace was entirely sufficient, noting that in his deepest, darkest moments of weakness, he was actually made strong.
And that guides us right into our final phase. Part 5, the eternal perspective, looking to the ultimate hope.
So where does this entire theological arc finally lead? It leads straight to eternity, causing a radical reframing of time itself. The sources draw the ultimate contrast here. No matter how heavy our present trials feel, they're actually described merely as a light affliction, which is but for a moment. Why? Because they are being weighed against the future, a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory. The ultimate hope described in the book of Revelation is an eternity defined by continuous, completely pain-free adoration. It's a time where all the former things have passed away, and there is absolutely no more death, no more sorrow, crying, or pain.
So we've traced the dominoes all the way to the very end. But before we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with one final thought, based directly on the arc we just explored together. If absolute grace truly removes all room for human boasting, and you are, simultaneously, both a flawed sinner and perfectly justified, how would fully embracing that paradox change the way you face your very next failure? Thank you so much for exploring this profound theological journey with me today. Keep digging, keep learning, and I'll see you next time.